Hi, my name is Claudie, and this video is going to be a part of the CES series. CES stands for Claudie's Emotional Spectrum Chart, which is a tool I created to explain why I believe our thoughts and our emotions are the beating hearts to every reality. Stay tuned because this video is going to be about relationship dynamics. This video is going to encapsulate them all and include examples of each one. But first, a brief review of what the colors represent. So here's a key code explaining what type of emotional energy the colors are representing. The colors orange, yellow, blue, purple, and green are representing the emotional energy of the individual that's in the middle of the chart. And then on the outer ends of the chart, you'll notice the top in lavender and the bottom encapsulated in red. All these colors interact with one another, so the best and most clear way for me to display it was like this, because this is the most linear form of it. So the top of the chart is lavender, representing positive emotional energy, and the bottom is red, and that's representing negative emotional energy. So the balanced emotional energy is represented by the middle of the chart. And in the emotional category, that energy is neutrality. In the physical category, that energy is behavior. In the intellectual category, that balanced energy is thought. And in the perspective category, it's MOAH. And then in the reality category, that balanced energy is represented by reality. So during this video, I will be using examples from history as empirical evidence to support each one of these theories. Please note that an occurrence can be displaying more than one type of relationship dynamic. This is because there are many ways for an occurrence to be perceived. This analysis will be done on a person or a body of people during a particular point in time, and it will be taking into account their limitations and constraints during that time. So the first theories are theories of dominance, and on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart, they're represented by negative impact and negative control, and they coincide with theories 1 and 1A. So the first relationship dynamic is Claudie's emotional spectrum chart theory 1, and is as follows. It is noted as negative impact and negative control on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart, and is when an established position of power, EPP, or a negative influencer recognizes another body of people in a positive emotional range and implements negative emotional transfer with negative forces and movers to yield negative probable forces over that person or body of people, placing them in a negative emotional range. A societal example of this is the divide and conquer strategy. This was actually the first relationship dynamic that I recognized and then organized. So an example of this is from the pimp joke on Dave Chappelle's Netflix special called The Bird Revelation. And many of you may not know this, but the pimp joke is actually from an actual person who lived and wrote this book and told his story. So given this is a joke, this joke stems from truth. So I'm going to explain this joke in terms of Claudie's emotional spectrum chart. The pimp creates an artificial conflict to place his bottom bitch, he calls her, in a negative emotional range because she's starting to enter a more positive emotional range. She has aspirations to join the circus, so this is putting her in a more positive emotional range. So he wants to establish dominance over her. So you can establish dominance over someone by placing them in a negative emotional range, which is exactly what he did. So he used negative emotional transfer, which is a fancy way of saying he made her feel bad, using negative forces and negative movers by tricking her into thinking that she killed someone. She was completely unaware of this conflict being staged for the benefit of the pimp. So she was making decisions based on negative forces and movers. So she was in a negative emotional range at that point. point because he tricked her into thinking that she killed someone when she didn't. So you'll see here at the bottom, these are the negative things her decisions were based off of. They were based on lies. They were based on distractions. They were based on fear, pain, all these things down here encapsulated in the red. But I'm going to go into detail and explain exactly which areas placed her in that range. So if we go through, she sensed that she killed someone with her sight, her thoughts, her perception. And that's noted here in number 1 in the emotional category. Then she felt something towards it, and those feelings were negative, worry, fear, very strong emotional feelings. So then the pimp reinforces these negative feelings with the negative forces seen in the intellectual category, which are non-factual knowledge, which could be seen as a lie. In this case, it is a lie. So he distracted her. How? He distracted her by having a butcher dress up like a doctor, by a man taking some medication to appear as though he's dead, and by movers dressing up, acting as if they were moving a dead body. All this just so that he could regain dominance over her. So how does one get out of this? Without her high level of tenacity and other positive forces and movers that help her carry out her goal of joining the circus, she remains in that negative emotional range, and she becomes vulnerable to manipulation. She becomes vulnerable to all the negative probable forces seen. In the physical category, that is the decreased probability for success. In the intellectual category, that's being more vulnerable to manipulation. So with her being in this range, she was vulnerable to all those negative probable forces encapsulated in the red, which is actually what achieves the pimp his dominance. All this allowed him to gain dominance over her for another 6 months as she continued to work for him for another 6 months. So his plan worked. Hi guys, I had to take a little break because school's starting and I had to go school shopping. So I look a little different and it is nighttime, so the screen is black. Just want to explain why that is. So back to theory number 1. This has actually been seen to have been applied to a body of people. This happened when Hitler and the Nazis basically obtained dominance over the Jewish community. After World War I, the Jewish community appeared to be doing the best out of the German population. And when I mean doing the best, I mean doing the best economically. As the socioeconomic gaps grew, so did the emotion towards those gaps. So those who had balanced negative emotions, that's encapsulated in red, towards the forces and movers of majority of the emotional, physical, and intellectual perceptional categories, would have been noted to be in a negative emotional range. In particular, those who had negative emotions towards an imbalance in the basic needs for continuous life, which include all the things in Maslow's hierarchy of needs physiological section, those who are equal in emotional energy. So this energy is what I call alertive energy, and alertive energy is the driving force for negative emotional energy. This then increased the chances of the results shown in the red as well, which are represented as probable forces on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart. But notice how all of those probable forces are encapsulated in the red, which represents negative emotional energy. When comparing the Jews to the general population in Germany after World War I, the general population is actually the societal group that would fall into the negative emotional range encapsulated in the red. And during that time, those who had balanced the positive emotions, which are all those things encapsulated in the lavender, towards the forces and movers in the emotional, physical, and intellectual perception categories. These group of people would have been noted to be in a positive emotional range, this increasing the chances for the results shown as positive probable forces on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart, all of which are encapsulated in the lavender. Again, when comparing the general population population of Germans to Jews, following World War I, the Jews would actually fall into the lavender areas of Claudie's emotional spectrum chart, which again is representing positive emotional energy for society and individual. This is also because there were fewer of them who had negative emotions towards the basic needs for continuous life as a percentage when compared to the general population of the Germans of that time. Basic needs for continuous life, all of which are encapsulated in Maslow's hierarchy of needs physiological subsection. With distinguishable economic and religious differences, it actually provided the ideal social climate to implement a strategy commonly known as divide and conquer, which has been used over centuries to gain dominance over others. Why? This is because the natural division caused by circumstance had already initiated the division part of the strategy. Hitler and the Nazis then reinforced those negative emotions with the forces and movers that can be seen in tactics like him fabricating a lie saying that the Jews were the reason for Germany's economic downfall. This fabrication is actually demonstrated in the forces and movers noted in the intellectual category, which, if you watch some of my other videos, are actually the way you can gain dominance over the minds of man, the intellectual category. And the tactics can also be seen in the physical perception category with a rumor of disease, which is actually represented by the health on Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the safety and security section. At the time, a disease called typhus was used initially to validate the relocation of the Jews from the general population. This relocation can actually be seen as physical dominance. AKA the physical dominance of man. Though there are plenty of other examples of Hitler using a whole bunch of negative forces and movers to dominate Germany as a whole. Which can be seen as negatively impacting or negatively controlling others. These two specific examples use very strong, or should I say powerful, negative emotions, stimulating the powerful negative emotion of fear with the disease of typhus to negatively control people physically, while also stimulating the very powerful emotion of hate with the fabricated ideas that Jews were the reasons for Germany's economic downturn. This reasoning for their financial ruin, putting Jews in a negative emotional range from a positive emotional range as the numbers affected increased. So by reinforcing negative emotions with negative individual and societal forces and movers, the Nazis maintained the negative emotional range for the general population of Germans while placing the Jews in a negative emotional range as well, thus obtaining dominance over both groups. This was, of course, all done for the benefit of Hitler and the Nazis. So here's theory 1A, and it is as follows. It is also represented by negative impact and negative control on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart, and is when an established position of power, EPP, or negative influencer, recognizes another person or body of people in a negative emotional range and reinforce the negative emotional range with negative emotional transfer, using negative forces and movers to yield negative probable forces over that person or body of people. This is done for the benefit of the EPP or influencer. An example of this can be seen with the history of slavery. Those with wealth and innovation with the intention of dominating person or body of people, this makes them a negative established position of power or a negative EPP. The negative in front of the EPP or influencer are actually representing their intention and coherent action, not if it's good or bad, but their intentions and their coherent actions and what those actions emotions and intent look like on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart. The positive is representing the increase of autonomy, and the negative is representing the increase of dominance. This theory is actually demonstrated throughout the history of the human race, with all different races of people dominating other people and them all using their wealth and innovation to do so. And those who weren't innovative or wealthy enough to effectively protect themselves would actually fall into the negative emotional range. The negative EPP then implements tactics that involve the negative individual and societal forces and movers seen in the red. The negative emotional energy to yield negative probable forces, which are also encapsulated in the red. And it's the negative probable forces that actually gains the EPP or influencer that dominance. At an individual level, this was also shown at the beginning of Dave Chappelle's joke. Now again, these are accounts taken from an actual pimp who used physical pain, which is noted in the physiological section of Maslow's hierarchy of needs down at the bottom, which is a fourth section for the physical perception category. He used this to stimulate negative emotions of both fear and pain. Though the innovation here isn't the coat hanger he used to beat her with, but the innovation of nature. The evolved dominant physical capability of men can be seen as nature's innovation. Dominant physical capabilities which science has proven to be more dominant when compared to a female. So because there's no intention between making someone stronger than another, this is just on a general basis. Naturally, the majority of men are stronger than women, aka nature's innovation. The pimp then used a bath and pain meds following his physical abuse. I think the quote was, "To have her feel so grateful that you fixed her that she forget that you were the mother effer that beat her in the first place." Him using this type of distraction to make her forget that he was the one to beat her in the first place is actually represented by the negative mover of lack of curiosity in the intellectual perception category on the chart. Again, this is because he was able to refocus her attention from what actually just happened, distract her, if you will, to alleviate the pain that he just caused her. The pain represented in the physiological section of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is equivalent to the basic needs for continuous life in that same category. So what he did was he caused an imbalance in these two areas. These two areas are one and the same. So the imbalance here was intensified pain. Now again, if there's an imbalance in the physiological subsection of Maslow's hierarchy of need, this is one of the driving forces for negative emotional energy. And I actually call it alertive emotional energy. So hence this pimp used his inherited physical innovation to dominate this female prostitute. So this is theory 2, and it is represented by positive impact and positive control on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart. This is when an established position of power, aka EPP, or an influencer recognizes another person or body of people in a positive emotional range, and it reinforces that range with positive emotional transfer using positive forces and movers to yield positive probable forces over that person or body of people. So this theory involves two different people or two different bodies of people who are both in a positive emotional range. So at an individual level, this relationship dynamic can be seen between a college professor and a student, let's say. And this is specific to an area of academia. Now, more specifically, one that encompasses truth and fact-based academia. This is represented by the factual knowledge in the intellectual category on Claudie's emotional spectrum chart here in the blue. The professor is seen to be in a positive emotional range if they and their area of academia is fueled by the positive forces and movers seen in the intellectual category. Now that would be factual knowledge, curiosity. At societal level, that would be communication and factual and applicable interpretation, which all would lead to the probable force of being less vulnerable to manipulation. If you look at the chart, all this is encapsulated in the lavender. And this isn't just isolated to the intellectual category category either. This is also applicable in the physical and emotional categories. So that would also put them in a positive emotional range if the professor is motivated by the positive forces and movers in the intellectual, emotional, and physical categories. But because this is specific to academia, there's a focus in the intellectual category. Now, same with the student. They too are considered to be in a positive emotional range if they and their area of academia is fueled by factual-based knowledge, curiosity, positive communication, and positive functional and applicable interpretation, all noted in the lavender. They too will have an increased probability of being least vulnerable to manipulation. Now, I focus in the intellectual category because this is the area of academia, so the focus would be on the intellectual category, but the other categories also apply, the emotional and the physical categories, which would gravitate the student to be more in a positive emotional range if they are driven by those things encapsulated in the lavender. So because they're both in a positive emotional range, how do we know who is benefiting from who? A lot of times these type of relationships benefit from one another, but actually it is the professor who is increasing the positive emotional range of the student. And this is because professors typically have more of a positive emotional range regarding the emotional, intellectual, and physical categories. So they have that confidence noted in Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the esteem section. They have the ability to take in facts, and they practice this with experience. So those areas count as well, and they also qualify the professor to be more in a positive range when compared to the student. So it's the student who will be benefiting from the professor or having their positive emotional range increased by their professor. Not to mention also the obvious wide range of perspective that the professor has in that area of academia versus the student. So the student, though they are in a positive emotional range, will benefit from the professor or increase their positive emotional range with a professor who is fueled by the positive movers and forces in the intellectual category. Now, when you apply this theory to bodies of people, an example of this can be seen during World War II when the U.S. ultimately decided to get involved and provide military assistance to England against the Nazis. So prior to World War II, England would be seen to be more in a positive emotional range when compared to the majority of countries existing on the planet during that time. And this would also be the same for the U.S. They would be considered to be in a positive emotional range, again, because the individual and societal forces and movers ranged more on the positive end when compared to their country counterparts, let's say. But when England came face to face with Germany's military innovation, which, keep in mind, surpassed any other popular form of innovation during that time, England was then faced with the possibility of being negatively controlled and negatively impacted by the Nazis and their negative innovation. Now, the positive and negative signs aren't representing good and bad here. Innovation in itself is just innovation. The positive and negative signs are representing the intention and coherent actions behind them. So the Nazis wanted dominance. The innovation might have been great, but the intention and the coherent action behind it was one of dominance. So that would fall into the negative emotional range, or fall to be a negative form of innovation because of the way it was used. So I just wanted to be clear as to what I mean by negative innovation. It's not that the innovation sucked, it's just that it was used for a negative cause or to stimulate negative emotional energy. So here with the US and England both in positive emotional ranges, the Nazis' threat actually gravitated England's societal and individual forces and movers towards the negative emotional range. Just the threat itself. Then, of course, with the physical actions, the physical bombings that took place during World War II in England. So they were trying very hard to put a society that gravitated more towards autonomy in a negative emotional range. This placed the US in a higher emotional range when compared to England at this point in time. Though when compared to other countries around the world, they were both considered to be more in a positive emotional range when it comes to the individual and societal movers and forces. So with the assistance of another body of people who happened to be in a positive emotional range, in this case the US was then able to help reinforce England's positive emotional range. And then England was able to effectively reinforce positive control using the positive forces and movers in majority of those categories: emotional, physical, intellectual, that then shapes the perspective, creating the reality. So the next theory is Claudie's emotional spectrum chart, theory 2A, and that is represented as positive impact and positive control on the Claudie's emotional spectrum chart. And this is when a positive established position of power, EPP, or a positive influencer recognizes another body of people in a negative emotional range and implements positive emotional transfer with positive forces and positive movers to yield positive probable forces over that person or body of people, placing them in a positive emotional range. This could be done for the benefit of the EPP or influencer, but is done for the benefit of the person or body of people. An example of this on an individual level can be seen with a parent-child relationship. This is because children are born into dependency, and dependency is one of the driving forces for the negative emotional range. So I guess children are born into a negative emotional range. Children are dependent on their parents for the majority of things seen in the physiological subsection of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then as they grow, they become more independent, but sometimes dependent on things seen on the safety and security section of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So children in general, or young adults in general, are more in a negative emotional range when it comes to the parent-child relationship dynamic. So typically a parent fulfills the majority of those needs in the physiological subsection of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And now by fulfilling the majority of the basic needs for continuous life, along with reinforcing and encouraging positive forces and movers noted in the physical, emotional, and intellectual categories, the child actually then gains the tools to increase their autonomy and to elevate their own emotional range. An example of this theory when applied to a body of people can be seen when the northern New England missionaries, quote, who poured into the South immediately after the Civil War to establish schools and to teach and acculturate the children of freed slaves. That's actually a quote from Dr. Soul's book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that's on page 35 if you're looking for it. This quote is demonstrating one body of people who are in a positive emotional range, and in this case that's the missionaries, who are then helping another body of people who happen to be in a negative emotional range, which were the children of freed slaves in this example. So they helped with achieving a positive emotional range by using the positive individual and societal movers and forces noted in the lavender in majority of the categories, the intellectual, the physical, and emotional categories, all encapsulated in the lavender. They used those positive societal forces and movers, which applied a positive emotional transfer and elevated the children of freed slaves to a more positive emotional range. This example, again, because it has to do with education, this especially applies to the intellectual category, which, as I've said before in previous videos, the intellectual category is the point where a society evolves or regresses. At an individual level, this is where one can control the minds of man. So the freedmen were in a negative emotional range because they were legally restricted to receive a fact-based education, among other restrictions. This law itself helped or aided in keeping the minds of man, in this case slaves, in a negative emotional range. So the missionaries, educating freedmen in such large numbers, directly assisted in increasing the positive emotional range among freemen. A wholly disproportionate share of future Black leaders came out of these schools and colleges established by New Englanders in the South, not even counting Oberlin College or Dunbar High School. These alumni of institutions founded as New England enclaves in the South included W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Walter White, Mary McLeod Bethune, A. Philip Randolph, James Farmer, Thurgood Marshall, and Martin Luther King Jr. In addition to these individuals from Southern institutions, the first Black man to graduate from Indianapolis, the first Black woman to earn a PhD, the first Black general, the first Black cabinet member, the first Black federal judge, all came from the same high school, Dunbar High School in Washington, with its culturally New England educated principles in its formative years. And if you look behind me, you can actually see some of the people he's talking about. I made a little board here, so if you were wondering who these people are, on the back, this is one of the quotes where I got and looked up some of these people from. So here's another quote. However discordant the philosophy of the American Missionary Association may have been with the multicultural views prevailing today, the crucial fact is that it worked, as so many of today's notions do not, and that is on page 39 of the same book by Dr. Thomas Sowell, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. This is theory 3, and it is an occurrence that moves an EPP influencer and others in that environment in a negative emotional range in relation to Claudie's emotional spectrum chart. This is typically seen with occurrences in nature, natural disasters, contagions, etc. So an example of this can be seen in the asteroids that killed the dinosaurs or the Black Plague. So that would encompass Claudie's emotional spectrum chart theory 3. With this theory, there are no intentions from a person or a body of people or coherent actions that apply. So this actually makes the entire environment subject to a negative emotional range. So this is Claudie's emotional spectrum chart theory 4, and this is when a balanced EPP or influencer, balanced due to their understanding of the creation process and the importance of both positive and negative emotional energy in the creation process, passes their understanding of that creation process to another. So this theory actually lies in the eyes of the beholder, because everybody's understanding of the creation process varies. But I've actually found this type of perspective within influencers like Dr. Thomas Sowell, Jordan Peterson, people who are truth seekers. So this relationship dynamic involves someone who has a realistic and logical understanding of the world that they live in, both past and present, along with understanding fact-based logic of both internal and external incentives that actually affect human behavior. So this relationship dynamic involves the EPP and or the influencer sharing this knowledgeable, honest understanding of how the world came to be with others around them. So they're sharing their knowledge of how the world came to be with people who are living now in their present time. So that is it for this relationship dynamic video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Would love to hear your thoughts, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for watching. Bye.